And this is exactly where the whole thing starts looking bad for Claressa Shields again, because while everybody keeps framing this like a messy little celebrity romance with PAPOOSE'S and Remy Ma, what is really happening is a lot uglier than that. Claressa is out here answering the questions, carrying the optics, taking the heat, defending the timeline, and wearing the backlash on her face, while PAPOOSE, yes, PAPOOSE, keeps finding a way to stay in the middle of the fire without ever standing in it for too long. That is the part people keep missing. This is not just about whether the relationship is real. It is not just about whether the divorce is pending. It is about why the most accomplished woman in the room somehow keeps ending up doing public relations for a man whose biggest talent right now seems to be surviving inside confusion. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. Because the woman they call the GWOT is moving like a champion, talking like a defender, posting like a lover, and reacting like somebody who still believes the situation is going to become clean if she just explains it one more time, while Captain Ambiguity over there keeps benefiting from every unresolved detail. Remy Ma's name is still hanging over it. The divorce timeline is still hanging over it. The somebody's husband question is still hanging over it. And the reason this keeps getting worse is that every public moment turns Claressa into the spokesperson for a mess she did not create. Listen to me carefully. When the athlete with the titles is the one doing image repair for the man with the pending paperwork, that is not romance running smoothly. That is narrative debt. And when we get to why that pattern keeps repeating itself, from interviews to comment sections to public appearances where Pap looks like he would rather be anywhere else, you're going to understand why this story was never really about love at all. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. Now, to understand why people are reacting so hard to this, you have to back all the way up, because this did not start with one interview clip, and it did not start with one shady comment section. The Claressa Shields, PAPOOSE, and Remy Ma situation has been moving through the culture like a low-burning fuse for a while now. Publicly, Claressa and PAPOOSE confirmed their relationship in late 2024 after the whole situation had already become a debate online. At the same time, the broader narrative around PAPOOSE and Remy Ma had already turned into its own public saga, because the former couple had separated, accusations were flying on both sides, and every new interview seemed to add another layer instead of cleaning anything up. According to multiple reports, PAPOOSE filed for divorce in May 2025, but the legal process had not been finalized, and that one unresolved fact is the crack in the foundation that keeps swallowing every attempt to make the situation look simple. That is why Claressa keeps getting hit with the same framing over and over. Not because people do not hear what she is saying, but because the optics keep beating the explanation. And that matters because Claressa is not just another influencer getting dragged in a comment section. This is a two-time Olympic gold medalist, an undisputed champion, a woman who built a public image on discipline, grit, and domination. So when somebody like that becomes more associated in certain corners of the internet with a relationship timeline than with her resume, that is not a small branding issue. That is a reputation tax. A heavy one. Hip-hop and boxing audiences have a lot in common. They respect toughness, they respect loyalty, and they absolutely do not forgive public contradiction. The minute people feel like the math is not matting, they stop listening to the explanation and start studying the body language. They start studying the silences. They start asking why the woman with the cleaner public track record is the one doing all the emotional labor in public. Does everybody understand how dangerous that is for a star's image? Because once your accomplishments stop being the first sentence people say about you, the internet will make sure the second sentence becomes the permanent one. And then there is the timing problem. Claressa is still in her prime professionally. This is supposed to be the stretch where the brand gets cleaner, bigger, and more bulletproof, not more entangled. Every time this story flares up, it pulls attention away from legacy building and drags it back to domestic confusion, public morality arguments, and clips designed to farm outrage. That is why I keep saying this is bigger than relationship gossip. Musically, culturally, financially, and reputationally, the stakes are all tangled together. Culturally, the audience is watching a woman who has conquered one of the hardest sports in the world get evaluated through a romance story she cannot fully control. Financially, any athlete at Claressa's level depends on brand equity, sponsorship confidence, clean positioning, and audience trust. Reputation-wise, every time she jumps out to defend the relationship, she risks looking less like a prizefighter and more like the unpaid spokesperson for Mr. Pending paperwork. And if you think the public does not notice that power imbalance, I promise you they do. The real question is not whether Claressa loves him. The real question is why the arrangement keeps requiring her to prove more than he does. The first visible piece of evidence is the one that just slapped the whole thing back into the headlines. Claressa's radio appearance on the street's morning takeover, where she got asked point-blank how much longer she was willing to be in a relationship with somebody's husband. Now, whether you think that question was rude, messy, disrespectful, or simply the question everybody knew was coming, that is not even the most important part. The important part is that Claressa had to answer it at all. And when she did, she immediately pushed back and said, in essence, pause, that is not somebody's husband because Papoose filed for divorce and filed because he is serious about her. She also argued that if people are going to call him somebody's husband, then they should also call Remy Ma his wife and hold her accountable too. On paper, that sounds like a firm defense. In real life, it sounds like Claressa once again stepping to the podium to explain why the audience should accept an unresolved legal and emotional situation as already morally settled. That is not a winning posture. It is defensive from the jump. And the second you are forced into legal timeline semantics on morning radio, the optics have already beaten you. Look at what that answer really tells us. It tells us Claressa knows the core public concern is not whether they like each other. It is whether the situation feels clean. So instead of getting to talk about dominance, training camp, or legacy, she is talking about filing status, process, and seriousness. That is courtroom language wearing relationship clothes. And I need everybody to think about how backwards that is. The champion is explaining the paperwork. The man at the center of the paperwork is not the one sitting there getting grilled.
Why?
Why is the face of the defense always Claressa? Why does Captain Ambiguity keep getting the luxury of being represented by the woman with the belts? That is not what a settled, secure, fully clarified public relationship looks like. That is what it looks like when one person is carrying the messaging for two. Then you move to the second visible piece of evidence, and it gets even stranger. In previous public comments, Claressa made it clear that from her perspective she and Papoose are together every day, or on the phone every day when they are apart, FaceTiming, talking, and in love. Again, that is emotionally direct. That is full-throated. That is the kind of language somebody uses when they want to erase all doubt. But here's the problem. When one side keeps giving maximum emotional certainty while the public picture keeps offering minimum visual certainty, the audience starts looking for the mismatch. This is how perception works now. People do not just hear what you say. They compare your certainty to the unresolved surroundings. If the divorce is still pending, if the old relationship is still part of the conversation, if the timeline still gets argued, then every passionate declaration turns into more material for the crowd to dissect instead of less. In other words, the harder Claressa tries to close the case publicly, the more people feel invited to reopen it. The third visible piece of evidence came at the BET Awards, and this one is brutal because the internet loves nothing more than a freeze frame and a facial expression. Claressa and Papoose showed up together, arm in arm, dressed for the moment, clearly presenting themselves publicly as a couple. On the surface, that should have helped. That should have read like confidence, stability, and visibility. Instead, what went viral was Papoos's expression. The internet immediately started clowning the way he looked while Claressa seemed upbeat and excited. Fans joked that he was scanning the room, scanning for Remy, scanning for trouble, scanning for anything but joy. Now, obviously, one expression at one event is not legal proof of anything. Let's be grown. But in pop culture, perception is a market, and that clip fed the market beautifully. Because once again the woman looked like she was fully standing in the moment, while the man looked like somebody attending consequences in formal wear. And when Claressa jumped in afterward with the line about protecting your woman at all times, she probably thought she was shutting the joke down. Instead, she accidentally kept the conversation alive by giving it another quote, another frame, another replayable moment. That right there is the trap. Public defense is rarely silent. It generates more content. More content generates more reaction. More reaction generates more narrative. And more narrative keeps the story breathing. If Papoose had been the one making the emotional cleanup speech every time the optics got weird, the public might read the arrangement differently. But because Claressa keeps doing it, the imbalance keeps screaming louder than the actual words. One person is being seen as committed. The other is being seen as accommodated. Does everybody understand how crazy that actually is? And then there is the fourth visible piece of evidence, which lives in the social media lane. Claressa has been extremely vocal in showing affection publicly, from responding warmly under Papoos's comments to doubling down with my man energy in public-facing spaces. On top of that, there were also public comments highlighted in entertainment coverage where she shut down people saying Papoose was only with her for money, even saying he pays her mortgage, covers car-related expenses, and handles travel and hotel costs. Now pause there. A lot of people heard that as a flex. And I get it. In one sense, she was trying to show that this is not a user situation, not a gold digger narrative, not a one-way financial extraction. Fine. But even that defense tells you where the scrutiny already is. Nobody secure and uncontroversial has to keep entering public court to provide exhibits. He loves me. He is serious. He filed. He pays. That is a cascade of proof language. That is not what calm looks like. That is what audit mode looks like. And every one of these public exhibits becomes a separate thread for the culture to pull. Some people will say Claressa is simply standing 10 toes down behind her man. Some will say the internet is unfairly punishing a woman for loving loudly. And yes, both of those things can be partly true. But the other truth is that when your love story keeps needing legal clarification, financial clarification, moral clarification, and emotional clarification all at once, the public does not see a fairy tale. They see strain. They see maintenance. They see a woman with championship-level discipline applying that discipline to a situation that may not deserve that level of rescue. And oh, do I have more for you, because this is the point where the story stops being about one awkward interview and becomes about a whole cultural pattern. See, the people who want to reduce this to y'all just hate love are not paying attention. This is not about hating love. This is about noticing when one person is giving main event energy to a relationship that keeps returning undercard optics. And I know some of PAPOOSE'S defenders are going to rush in and say, well, he filed, so what more do y'all want? No, no, no. That is exactly the lazy version of the conversation. Filing is not the same as resolution. Public presence is not the same as public clarity. And when we get into how this whole thing interacts with fan culture, athlete branding, and even Claressa's own sideways tensions with people like Amanda Serrano, you're going to see why Mr. Pending Paperwork has been surviving off narrative smoke for a very long time. Because here is where the cultural evidence starts stacking up in a way that should make everybody uncomfortable. First, look at how the fanbase reacts every single time Claressa pops out with PAPOOSE. The immediate conversation is not, what a power couple. It is, something feels off. That is not because the audience has secret access to private facts. It is because the audience is reading consistency. They're watching who seems eager, who seems quiet, who is doing the explaining, and who gets defended. The BET Awards clip became a perfect example of this. People were not writing long essays. They were just instinctively reading the mismatch. Claressa looked fully present in the performance of coupledom. PAPOOSE looked like a man carrying weather on his forehead. And the internet is ruthless with that kind of footage because audiences trust visual contradiction more than verbal reassurance. If the body language says storm and the caption says sunshine, people believe the storm. Second, the somebody's husband label keeps surviving despite Claressa's pushback, and that tells you the public has not accepted the cleanup narrative. Not fully. Once a phrase like that sticks, it becomes cultural shorthand. It condenses all the paperwork, all the accusations, all the unresolved moral debate into one ugly little tagline. That is why Claressa reacted so sharply to it. She knows it is not just an insult. It is a frame. It reduces everything she is into one controversial choice. And that is exactly why I keep saying she is paying a heavier cultural price than PAPOOSE. He gets to live inside ambiguity. She gets attached to the summary. And in pop culture, the summary is what travels. The summary is what people remember. The summary is what follows you longer than the explanation does. Third, there is the broader crossover reaction between boxing fans and hip-hop fans, and that crossover matters because Claressa does not live in one audience silo. Boxing people judge professionalism, discipline, and focus. Hip-hop adjacent audiences judge authenticity, optics, and who looks foolish. When both of those audiences start overlapping on a story like this, the commentary multiplies. That is why this relationship story keeps having so much staying power. It hits two ecosystems at once. In one ecosystem, people say, why is a champion dealing with this public circus? In the other, they say, why is the man always at the center of the drama, but never the one taking the biggest reputational hit? That overlap creates a unique kind of cultural pressure. You are not just being discussed. You are being triangulated. Fourth, Claressa's separate public friction with Amanda Serrano adds another interesting layer. In a 2025 interview, Claressa criticized Serrano's mentality and predicted Katie Taylor would beat her again, saying Serrano and her team seemed stuck in their ways and that Serrano was not mentally capable of adjusting the right way. Now, whether you agree with that boxing assessment or not, the cultural read was bigger than the technical take.
Why?
Because when an athlete is already under relationship scrutiny, every extra public beef starts looking less like confidence and more like displacement. Some fans will always love that sharp-tongued, no-filter energy. Others will read it as somebody punching sideways while the center of their own narrative remains messy. And this is where nuance matters. I am not saying Claressa cannot have boxing opinions.
Of course she can.
She is Claressa Shields. But I am saying audiences do not consume comments in isolation. They consume them inside a running storyline. So when she is talking heavy at Amanda while still publicly defending Papoose, some people hear champion talk, and others hear deflection. That split perception is real whether her supporters want to admit it or not. Now, let me be fair for 1 second, because credibility matters. There is a counterargument here. The counterargument is that Claressa and Papoose are adults. The divorce process takes time. The public is overly judgmental, and people are especially hard on women who refuse to be ashamed of the men they choose. That is not a crazy argument. In fact, parts of it are obviously true. The internet can be punitive. The public can be sexist. And not every delayed legal timeline means some grand deception is happening.
Fine.
I will grant all of that. But here is where that counterargument collapses. Even if all of that is true, it still does not explain why the public burden keeps landing mostly on Claressa. It still does not explain why her energy has to be so declarative while Papoos's public presentation remains so strategically low resolution. It still does not explain why she keeps sounding like the lead counsel for a relationship that allegedly benefits both people equally. And that is what changes the whole picture. Because once you stop arguing over whether the relationship should be allowed and start asking who is carrying the reputational labor, the answer gets very uncomfortable very fast. The woman with the cleaner competitive legacy, the brighter disciplined brand, and the more to lose is the one doing the defending. The man with the older marriage controversy, the pending paperwork, and the benefit of plausible silence is the one being defended. That is upside down. That is a reverse protection system. And that hard pivot right there is the signal that this is no longer just a celebrity drama conversation. This is where the real machinery shows itself. Because the deeper story here is not romance. The deeper story is narrative economics. The first systemic angle is this. Ambiguity is profitable, especially for men in public culture. A clean statement closes a loop. An unresolved statement feeds one. If you are a public male figure with a complicated relational timeline, the cheapest survival strategy is often to let the loudest woman in the room explain what you refuse to pin down completely yourself. That way you keep emotional access to the audience. You avoid taking the full moral hit, and you leave enough fog in the air that every camp can still project what it wants to believe. This is why I keep calling him Captain Ambiguity. Not because the relationship is fake, but because the lack of full closure is doing active work. It keeps him central. It keeps her explanatory. It keeps the audience debating. And debate is a renewable resource online. The second systemic angle is brand asymmetry. Claressa's brand is built on achievement, sacrifice, preparation, and visible excellence. Papoos's current public relevance, at least in this chapter, is far more entangled with relational narrative and social drama. Those are not equal brand structures. When two unequal structures merge in public, the cleaner brand almost always absorbs the dirtier mess unless boundaries are aggressively protected. That is not personal. That is brand math. In business language, Claressa is exposing high-value reputation assets to low-clarity controversy. Every time she steps in to over-explain, she is spending premium equity to stabilize a shared narrative that does not return premium value to her career.
Think about that.
She is using championship credibility to subsidize romantic controversy. That is not a smart long-term exchange rate. And this matters even more in sports entertainment because athletes do not just sell wins. They sell focus. They sell mythology. They sell the sense that they are above ordinary confusion because ordinary confusion is what everybody else is drowning in. The minute an audience starts seeing you as governed by the same messy emotional loops as the rest of the timeline, some of that exceptionalism leaks out. Not all of it, but enough to matter. The culture starts saying, yeah, she's great, but, and that but is deadly. That but is how legacy gets nicked. That but is how greatness gets made conversational instead of unquestionable. The third systemic angle is gendered reputational labor. Men in scandal-adjacent relationship stories often get to remain vague, detached, even passive, and the public will call that stoicism, privacy, or maturity. Women do not get that luxury. If they are silent, people call them delusional. If they speak, people call them defensive. If they love loudly, people call them desperate. If they step back, people call it proof the rumors were right. So what happens? Many women in public life overperform certainty just to keep the room from assigning them weakness. That is exactly why Claressa's public defense sounds so emphatic. She is not just defending the relationship. She is defending herself against becoming the joke of the story. And unfortunately, that overperformance can feed the exact joke she is trying to outrun. This is why I say Papoose benefits whether he means to or not. He benefits from a gender system in public culture where the woman attached to him feels compelled to narrate stability at full volume. He benefits from the moral fog created by a legal process that the audience does not fully track. He benefits from the fact that every time Claressa responds to criticism, she refreshes the storyline and keeps him at the center of discourse without him having to carry equal communicative weight. That is a leverage position. Maybe intentional, maybe not. But it is real. The fourth systemic angle is the attention economy itself. Social platforms do not reward completed stories. They reward semi-resolved ones. A finalized divorce would reduce debate. A clean, mutually acknowledged timeline would reduce speculation. A couple dynamic where both people carry equal public clarity would reduce asymmetrical outrage. But a story where the champion keeps defending, the public keeps doubting, the X remains part of the frame, and the man remains slightly opaque? That story is algorithmic candy. It creates clips, reactions, stitchable opinions, live commentary, podcast segments, and endless moral adjudication. The system loves that. And when the system loves something, it will keep feeding it until somebody opts out. Now, let's take that one level higher. If Claressa keeps answering questions that should be redirected to Papoose, she is functionally consenting to a media workflow in which her excellence funds the visibility of the relationship controversy. That is the painful part. The more famous and respected she becomes, the more valuable her defense becomes to the story. Every time she says, "We love each other," it lands bigger because it is Claressa Shields saying it. Every time she says, "He filed," it lands bigger because it is Claressa Shields saying it. Every time she says, "He takes care of me," it lands bigger because it is Claressa Shields saying it. Do you see how the machine works? Her stature gives emotional legitimacy to a situation that still carries unresolved public tension. Her greatness is being used as stabilizing collateral. And here is the cruel irony. The same discipline that made her a champion can also trap her in a bad public pattern. Champions believe they can outwork uncertainty. They believe they can explain better, train harder, show more consistency, and eventually force the narrative to align. That mindset wins belts. But in messy public relationships, sometimes that same mindset becomes a liability because not every narrative can be beaten into submission through repetition and loyalty. Sometimes the more you prove, the more people ask why proving is so necessary in the first place. That is the gear shift. That is the real story. This is not woman in love gets judged by the internet. This is woman with a premium discipline brand keeps being drafted into a low-clarity narrative structure that disproportionately taxes her image, while the man at the center of it keeps enjoying the protection of ambiguity. And once you understand that, the truth bomb lands differently. The most revealing thing in this whole saga is not that Claressa loves Papoose. It is not even that the divorce is reportedly still pending. The most revealing thing is that every major public moment keeps teaching the same lesson. Papoose does not have to publicly resolve a tension for the arrangement to keep working in his favor, because Claressa keeps absorbing the pressure for him. That is what gets played again really means here. It does not mean she is naive. It does not mean the relationship is fake. It means the power distribution of the public narrative keeps leaning against her, and she keeps stepping back into that slope anyway. Think about the sequence. The relationship becomes public and the controversy lands on her image. The timeline gets debated, and she becomes one of the loudest defenders of the legitimacy. The radio interview happens, and she is the one explaining why he is not somebody's husband. The public outing happens, and she is the one smoothing over the weird optics. The money rumors surface, and she is the one presenting financial evidence. Over and over and over again, the champion is doing the cleanup, the reassurance, the clarification, the emotional labor. And Mr. Pending Paperwork gets to remain the gravitational center without matching her level of public accountability. That is not partnership at its cleanest. That is asymmetry at work. And what makes it even worse is that Claressa is so accomplished that the audience can feel the imbalance instinctively. If this were somebody with no stature, people would shrug and move on. But when it is a woman who fought her way into history, every ounce of avoidable mess feels more wasteful. It feels like watching a Ferrari idle in traffic because somebody else lost the keys. The frustration people feel is not just moral judgment. Some of it is disappointment. Some of it is people asking why a woman with that much force in every other area of life keeps putting herself in the position of having to explain a grown man's unfinished narrative. And the consequence of that is severe. The culture starts to flatten her. Not the athlete entirely, but the public conversation around her. Instead of undisputed champion, people reach first for PAPOOSE'S girlfriend. Instead of legacy, they reach for pending divorce drama. Instead of all-time great, they reach for the woman defending the man with the paperwork still open. That is a brutal downgrade in framing, and it is exactly why I call this the real loss condition. Not losing him. Losing narrative altitude. That is the danger. Because once a star falls from legacy conversation into recurring mess conversation, climbing back out requires deliberate distance, not louder defense. So here is the harshest truth of all. The issue is not whether PAPOOSE chose Claressa. The issue is whether he has structured this chapter of his public life in a way that asks Claressa to pay more reputationally than he does. And based on the evidence in front of us, I think the answer is yes. Maybe not with malicious intent. Maybe not with some evil master plan. But yes, structurally, publicly, functionally, yes. He is benefiting from the fact that she loves hard, speaks clearly, and carries herself like somebody who can muscle a messy narrative into coherence. And every time she does that while he remains comparatively underdefined, she gets played by the setup again. But here is where I do believe the story can still turn, because the hero in this situation is not the relationship. The hero is Claressa Shields when she remembers who she was before the internet decided to make her a romantic defense attorney. The hero is the woman whose discipline built a kingdom nobody can snatch away with a comment section. The hero is the athlete whose resume does not need a man to validate it, soften it, or explain it. And if she wants the public to stop reducing her to this story, the path is actually very simple even if it is not emotionally easy. Stop carrying what is not yours. Stop over-explaining what did not begin with you. Stop volunteering championship-grade credibility to patch holes in a narrative that belongs equally, and in some parts more heavily, to him. Because one person makes history with gloves on. The other keeps surviving through fog. That is the contrast one-liner the whole culture can already feel even when they do not say it that way. While Captain Ambiguity is benefiting from unresolved perception, Claressa still has the power to walk back into the center of her own greatness without asking anybody's permission. Listen, I just have to say this plainly. If she redirected even half the energy she has spent defending this relationship back toward tightening her brand, centering her training, and letting other people answer for their own timelines, the entire public conversation would start changing.
Fast.
Not overnight, but fast. And that is why I am not ending this on doom. The right person is still the one with the real work ethic, the real accomplishments, and the real legacy. The public can clown. The blogs can farm reactions. The comments can keep shouting somebody's husband until their thumbs fall off. But belts are real. Gold medals are real. Undisputed greatness is real. That is why Claressa is not finished just because this chapter looks ugly. She is only finished if she keeps lending her voice to a structure that shrinks her. If she reclaims the frame, the story changes. If she refuses the role of permanent explainer, the story changes. If the next time somebody asks a paperwork question, she reminds them that the paperwork belongs to the people who signed it, not to her, the story changes. And that is the controlled optimism here. The culture may be noisy, but truth has a way of settling in once the smoke clears. If PAPOOSE is really as serious as Claressa says, then eventually the public structure should begin matching the private claims. If it does not, that tells its own story. Either way, the evidence will speak. And Claressa's best move from here is not louder loyalty. It is cleaner positioning. The undefeated machine does not need to keep fighting a two-front war, one in the ring and one in the comments, just to protect a narrative that keeps taxing her more than it taxes him. This is only the start, though, because there are at least two things everybody should be watching from here. First, whether the legal and public status around PAPOOSE and Remy Ma ever reaches the kind of clarity that makes these questions stop landing on Claressa in the first place. Not vague hints, not implied seriousness, not more comment section devotion, clarity. Real clarity. Second, whether Claressa herself changes the way she handles this in public. Does she keep stepping into the line of fire to explain, or does she finally make people redirect those questions to the man whose unresolved chapter keeps shadowing her image? That decision is going to tell us everything. And if history is any guide, more noise is coming. More clips, more reactions, more people trying to force one more viral moment out of this triangle of optics, loyalty, and unfinished narrative. So if you are watching this story with your eyes open, stay locked in, because the next real reveal is not going to come from another cute caption. It is going to come from who is still talking when accountability knocks. If Captain Ambiguity ever has to explain his own situation with the same energy Claressa has used to defend it, that might be the moment this whole story flips. And if it never happens, that tells you the setup was never balanced to begin with. So keep your eye on the pattern, not just the posts. And if you want the next video, I have one for you already. The moment a public relationship stops being a love story and starts becoming a brand liability, the signs show up long before the breakup does. And there is one specific sign, one repeated public behavior, that predicts the fallout almost every single time. That next breakdown is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable because it is not about who cheated, who lied, or who loved harder. It is about who kept doing public labor for a private arrangement that was never equally weighted. And once you see that pattern, you will start recognizing it everywhere.